Hello there, and welcome to Sacred Investigations, where ancient mysteries meet modern forensics, and forgotten truths emerge from the silence of millennia. Tonight, we trace one of history's most extraordinary transformations, a journey that begins in the council chambers of cosmic gods and ends in the whispered prayers of billions. The name that would reshape civilization itself, Yahweh. If you find comfort in these quiet explorations, where archaeology becomes revelation and evidence becomes wonder, I'd be grateful for your support. As you settle in, perhaps take a moment to consider the weight of what we're about to uncover. Somewhere, carved in cuneiform on clay tablets older than memory, lie the first echoes of a name that would outlive empires. The investigation begins in a secure facility outside Jerusalem, where Dr. Elias Thorne examines artifacts that most scholars only dream of touching. His weathered hands, steady despite 40 years of fieldwork, hold a clay fragment dating to the 3rd millennium before our era. The cuneiform marks seem to dance in the laboratory's controlled lighting, each wedge-shaped impression a window into humanity's earliest attempts to name the divine. What we're examining tonight, Dr. Thorne says, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has stood in Mesopotamian ruins at dawn, isn't just religious history, it's the evolution of human consciousness itself. The transformation we're tracking spans over 2,000 years and represents the most significant shift in human thinking since the development of written language. You see, before Yahweh stood alone in the heavens, before his name filled the songs of Israel and echoed through the prayers of half the world, he walked among a crowded pantheon. The Anunnaki, those cosmic administrators of ancient Mesopotamia, governed a universe where divine power was shared, distributed, negotiated like portfolios in some celestial corporation. Each god claimed territory, each deity maintained jurisdiction over specific forces of nature and human experience. Dr. Sarah Kadish joins the investigation from her position as the world's leading specialist in ancient code systems. Her doctoral work at Hebrew University focused on the linguistic archaeology of divine names, and she speaks with the precision of someone who has spent decades deciphering messages that were never meant to be understood by outsiders. The divine names weren't just words, she explains, adjusting her reading glasses as she examines a tablet fragment. They were operational protocols for accessing cosmic authority. When a Sumerian priest spoke the name Enlil, he wasn't simply addressing a deity, he was activating a specific channel of divine communication. Picture the ancient Near East as a vast intelligence network, where information flowed along trade routes and caravan paths like classified documents moving through secure channels. Religious concepts traveled with the same urgency as political intelligence, copied, translated, adapted by each civilization that encountered them. A merchant carrying goods from Babylon to Canaan also carried stories, prayers, and the names of gods. A diplomatic marriage between royal houses meant the exchange of religious practices alongside political alliances. In the earliest Sumerian records, dating to approximately 3500 BCE, the Anunnaki appear as a council of divine beings, 50 great gods who governed heaven and earth through a complex bureaucratic structure that mirrored human political systems. Anu ruled the cosmic heights, commanding respect through sheer seniority rather than active intervention. Enlil commanded the atmosphere and storms, his voice literally the wind that brought life-giving rain or devastating floods. Enki controlled the subterranean waters of wisdom, serving as the divine patron of technology, magic, and human civilization. Their stories, etched in cuneiform across thousands of clay tablets, describe a universe where multiple powers maintained cosmic balance through cooperation, conflict, and occasionally outright war. These weren't abstract forces or philosophical concepts. They were personalities with desires, ambitions, and very human emotions. They formed alliances, betrayed each other, fell in love, and held grudges across millennia. The cosmos was essentially a political drama writ large, with humanity serving as both audience and occasional pawn. Yet somewhere in this divine bureaucracy, a different kind of deity was emerging. Not through conquest or cosmic battle, not by accumulating more territory or defeating rival gods, but through something unprecedented in ancient religion: relationship. The God who would become Yahweh began his journey not as supreme ruler of heaven and earth, but as intimate companion to a small group of desert nomads whose survival depended more on trust than on ritual sacrifice. Dr. Mordecai Benaya, our field reconnaissance specialist, has spent the last 30 years mapping the desert regions where this transformation first took root. His expertise comes from a unique combination of archaeological training and military intelligence background. He served as a reconnaissance officer in the Israel Defense Forces before completing his doctorate in ancient Near Eastern studies. His weathered hands trace coordinates on satellite imagery as he speaks, the same way he once plotted patrol routes through hostile territory. The Shasu nomads of the southern deserts worshipped a deity they called Yu, likely an early form of Yahweh, he explains, pointing to a region that straddles the modern borders of Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. But this wasn't temple worship with elaborate rituals and professional priesthoods. This was covenant in motion, a relationship that traveled with the people rather than remaining fixed in sacred geography. The difference is crucial, and it would prove to be the key to everything that followed. Egyptian records from the late Bronze Age mention these Shasu tribes, describing them as troublesome nomads who lived beyond the reach of imperial control. To the Egyptian scribes, they were a minor administrative headache, people who refused to settle in cities where they could be properly taxed and conscripted. They were herders and traders, following ancient migration routes that connected the copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula to the markets of Canaan and Damascus. But what the Egyptian bureaucrats couldn't understand was that the Shasu's mobility wasn't just economic, it was theological. Their survival depended on reading the subtle signs of desert weather, the movement of stars, the promise of distant water. In such an environment, religious practice had to be as mobile as life itself. Their God reflected their existence, immediate, present in crisis, unbound by the architectural constraints that defined worship for settled peoples. You can feel the difference, can't you? The contrast between a God who dwells in ziggurats and one who travels with tents. The Anunnaki required temples, elaborate rituals, professional priesthoods to mediate their power. They were cosmic bureaucrats who demanded formal protocols for communication. Yahweh's early worshippers encountered him in thunder over barren hills, in the crackle of lightning across empty sky, in the sudden appearance of water in seemingly lifeless rock. Dr. Leah Ashkenazi, our strategic religious historian, has spent 15 years documenting how this desert theology gradually infiltrated the highland settlements of Canaan. Her approach combines traditional archaeological methods with intelligence analysis techniques she learned during her service with Mossad's research division. The early Israelites weren't monotheists, she notes, reviewing ceramic evidence from excavated sites across the central hill country. They were henotheists, acknowledging the existence of other gods while maintaining exclusive loyalty to one. It was a theological innovation with profound political implications. The evidence speaks with startling clarity to those trained to read it. Archaeological teams have uncovered inscriptions from Kuntilet Ajrud, a remote site in the Sinai Peninsula, that speak of Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah, suggesting that even Yahweh once had a divine consort, fitting the standard pattern of ancient Near Eastern pantheons. Other sites reveal evidence of household shrines containing figurines of multiple deities, including goddess figures that likely represent Asherah, the Canaanite mother goddess. But something was already different about Yahweh worship, something that would prove crucial to its eventual evolution. While other gods were bound to specific cities and territories, Marduk to Babylon, Asher to Assyria, Amun-Ra to Thebes, Yahweh's domain seemed to be the covenant itself, the relationship between deity and people. This portability would become his greatest strategic advantage in an era of constant political upheaval. The transformation accelerated through crisis, as it always does. When the Assyrian war machine rolled across the northern kingdom in 722 BCE, it didn't just destroy cities and deport populations. It shattered theological assumptions that had endured for centuries. Dr. Nathaniel Kaplan, our ancient intelligence analyst, has reconstructed the geopolitical pressures that forced rapid religious evolution during this period. Defeat usually meant your gods were weak, he explains, spreading satellite photographs of ancient Assyrian siege works across his desk. The standard response was to adopt the victor's deities, or at least add them to your pantheon. But Israel's prophets interpreted military disaster as divine discipline. Yahweh wasn't defeated. He was the agent of judgment, using foreign armies as instruments of correction. This represented revolutionary thinking that would reshape not just Israelite religion, but human understanding of divine justice. Instead of abandoning their God for apparently stronger ones, the survivors reimagined defeat as covenant enforcement. Yahweh's apparent absence became evidence of his moral authority rather than proof of his weakness. This psychological pivot, transforming military disaster into spiritual insight, would prove crucial to monotheism's eventual emergence. You witness this evolution accelerating through the prophetic literature that emerged during and after the Assyrian crisis. Elijah's confrontation with Baal's prophets on Mount Carmel wasn't just a miracle contest. It was a theological declaration that the old divine council was being dissolved. When fire fell from heaven, consuming not just the sacrifice but the stones of the altar itself, the message was clear. Yahweh would no longer share cosmic authority with other deities. The prophet Hosea, writing in the shadow of Assyrian invasion, transformed the political relationship between God and nation into something unprecedented: divine marriage. Israel's political alliances with foreign powers became spiritual adultery. The nation's worship of other gods became emotional betrayal of an exclusive covenant. This personalizing of the divine relationship would have profound implications for how future generations understood both God and themselves. Professor Rebecca Mizrahi, our cultural transmission specialist, has analyzed the literary evidence from this period with forensic precision. Her background combines advanced degrees in comparative literature and ancient languages with practical experience in counterintelligence. She spent a decade with the CIA's analytical division before transitioning to academic research. The prophetic literature isn't just religious poetry, she observes. It's strategic communication designed to maintain group cohesion under extreme external pressure. The prophets weren't just religious visionaries, they were master communicators working to preserve cultural identity under existential threat. When Amos declared that Yahweh's voice roared from Zion, making the shepherd's pastures wither, he was using imagery that would resonate with both urban elites and rural populations. When Isaiah described Yahweh as a warrior returning from battle with garments stained crimson, he was speaking the language of an age that understood divine power primarily through military metaphor. But the most profound transformation was yet to come. The Babylonian exile beginning with the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, should have meant the end of Yahweh worship according to the logic of ancient religion. His temple was destroyed, his city reduced to rubble, his people scattered across the known world. In the ancient mindset, such total defeat meant the god had been proven powerless against superior deities. Instead, something unprecedented occurred in human religious history. Separated from land and temple, the exiled scribes reimagined their god not as defeated, but as the cosmic architect orchestrating events according to a plan too vast for human comprehension. If Yahweh could manipulate the Babylonian Empire to execute judgment on Jerusalem, then he must control all of history. The local storm god of desert nomads was being reconceptualized as the universal sovereign of human destiny. Dr. Joseph Sephardi joins our investigation team from his position as Director of Linguistic Archaeology at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. His specialty involves reconstructing ancient thought patterns through careful analysis of vocabulary shifts and metaphorical structures in biblical literature. The exile forced a complete theological revolution, he explains, his fingers tracing Hebrew text on a computer screen displaying high-resolution scans of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. The writers had to explain how their all-powerful God could allow his own temple to be destroyed. Their solution was to claim he had orchestrated the destruction himself. Listen to how the exilic prophet known as Second Isaiah describes this transformation. "Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me. I, even I, am Yahweh, and apart from me there is no Savior." This wasn't theological evolution. It was revolution. The entire cosmic order was being rewritten in exile, and Yahweh stood alone in the newly emptied heavens. Yet trace the language carefully, and you'll hear echoes of the older polytheistic system. When Yahweh rides upon the clouds, he's appropriating imagery that originally belonged to Baal, the Canaanite storm god. When he commands the waters of chaos, he's employing mythology that traces back to Marduk's victory over Tiamat in Babylonian creation epics. When he creates through divine word alone, he's using a concept that appears throughout ancient Near Eastern literature in various forms. The monotheistic revolution didn't erase the Anunnaki and their fellow deities. It absorbed them, gathering their scattered attributes into one transcendent figure. This process of theological consolidation was so thorough that modern readers often miss the polytheistic fossils embedded in biblical poetry. When Psalm 82 speaks of God taking his place in the divine council and judging among the gods, it preserves memory of an older worldview where Yahweh presided over other divine beings rather than existing in splendid isolation. Dr. Hannah Kohenet, our manuscript analysis specialist, has traced how oral traditions were woven into narrative architecture capable of surviving displacement and cultural disruption. Her academic training at Oxford was supplemented by practical experience in intelligence document analysis. She spent 8 years with Britain's Government Communications Headquarters before transitioning to biblical studies. The scribes weren't just recording history, she explains, while examining papyrus fragments under magnification. They were creating portable theology. Yahweh became the God who traveled in scrolls rather than statues, who dwelt in words rather than temples. This literary revolution had profound psychological consequences that extend far beyond ancient religion. The Anunnaki and other traditional deities required physical presence, temple visits, ritual objects, priestly mediation. Worshippers had to travel to specific locations at appointed times to encounter the divine. Yahweh's transformation into literary presence meant he could be encountered through reading, through study, through individual contemplation conducted anywhere in the world. The divine became democratized in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier religious systems. a Jewish merchant in Alexandria, could access the same divine presence as the high priest in Jerusalem simply by unrolling a Torah scroll. A Babylonian exile could maintain covenant relationship without traveling hundreds of miles to offer sacrifice. This portability would prove crucial as Jewish communities spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Contemporary neuroscience suggests that this shift from visual to textual religious experience actually rewired human cognition in measurable ways. Dr. Thorne's team has collaborated with researchers at Johns Hopkins to study how different modes of religious practice affect brain function. When you compare brain scans of people engaged in image-based worship versus text-based study, he notes, you see activation in completely different neural networks. The move from idol to scripture literally changed how human beings process spiritual experience. Modern archaeological intelligence reveals the full scope of this transformation through techniques that would have seemed like magic to ancient scribes. Satellite imagery shows the ruins of countless Mesopotamian temples, their ziggurats reduced to tells in the desert, slowly being reclaimed by sand and time. Ground penetrating. Radar maps the foundations of structures that once housed elaborate pantheons. The gods they contained are known today only through academic study, museum displays, and the occasional Hollywood blockbuster. But Yahweh's transformation into literary presence ensured survival beyond architecture. While Marduk's temple in Babylon crumbles, and Enlil's ziggurat at Nippur exists only as an archaeological site, Yahweh continues to live in libraries, homes, and individual consciousness worldwide. This represents one of history's most successful adaptations to changing operational environment. From the perspective of strategic analysis, this evolutionary path demonstrates remarkable foresight, whether conscious or instinctive. While other ancient deities remained bound to obsolete delivery systems, temples vulnerable to conquest, statues subject to destruction, city-states destined for collapse, Yahweh evolved into something far more resilient, an idea backed by a portable information system. Dr. Kadish returns to her linguistic analysis, this time focusing on how the divine name itself underwent transformation during the exile period. The Tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew letters that spell Yahweh's name, became increasingly sacred during this period, she explains, projecting ancient Hebrew text onto the laboratory wall. By the time the exiles returned from Babylon, pronunciation of the actual name was restricted to the high priest, and only during the most sacred ceremonies. This development wasn't accidental. In ancient cultures, knowing someone's true name meant having power over them. Gods, demons, and magical forces could be controlled through correct pronunciation of their names. By making Yahweh's name unspeakable, the post-exilic community was simultaneously protecting his power and acknowledging his transcendence. He became the God whose name was too holy for human lips, too powerful for casual invocation. The psychological impact of this naming restriction rippled through centuries of religious development. When people couldn't speak God's name, they had to find other ways to relate to the divine. The result was an explosion of titles, metaphors, and theological concepts that emphasized relationship over dominance. Yahweh became Father, King, Shepherd, Rock, Fortress, but never again simply a name to be manipulated through ritual technique. Professor Ashkenazi has tracked how this theological evolution influenced political development throughout the ancient world. Monotheism wasn't just a religious innovation, she notes, while reviewing correspondence between Jewish communities scattered across the Persian Empire. It was a survival strategy that allowed small populations to maintain identity without territorial control. When your God transcends geography, your people can survive displacement. The genius of this approach becomes obvious when you examine how it addressed existential crisis. The Anunnaki offered cosmic bureaucracy, divine power balanced among competing authorities with clear jurisdictions and established protocols. This system worked well when civilizations remained stable and people lived their entire lives within the same cultural framework, but it collapsed under the pressure of imperial conquest and population displacement. Yahweh offered something unprecedented: cosmic coherence. One will behind all events, one purpose threading through history's apparent chaos, one relationship that could survive any external disruption. This wasn't just theology. It was practical psychology for people living under constant threat of cultural annihilation. You see this crystallizing in the written Torah, compiled during and after the exile period. These weren't just religious texts. They were strategic documents, designed to preserve identity across diaspora and ensure cultural transmission across generations. Dr. Kohenet has traced how oral traditions from different periods and regions were woven into narrative architecture capable of surviving conquest, displacement, and assimilation pressure. The scribes understood something that modern nation-states are still learning, she observes, while examining manuscript evidence from multiple ancient libraries. Military power is temporary, but ideas properly preserved and transmitted can outlast any empire. They were building something more durable than bronze weapons or stone fortifications. They were constructing immortal identity. This literary revolution created what intelligence analysts call distributed redundancy. Instead of concentrating divine presence in a single vulnerable location, Yahweh's essence was encoded in texts that could be copied, hidden, memorized, and reconstructed. Every Jewish community that possessed Torah scrolls became a backup site for the entire religious system. Destroy one copy, and hundreds of others preserved the same information in communities scattered across 3 continents. The practical implications extended far beyond religious preservation. Jewish communities developed educational systems focused on literacy and textual analysis centuries before such practices became common in other cultures. This intellectual infrastructure would prove crucial to Jewish survival through repeated periods of persecution and displacement. When other populations were devastated by the loss of their temples and traditional leadership, Jewish communities could reconstitute themselves around portable libraries and shared interpretive traditions. Dr. Benaya has spent considerable time analyzing how this transformation influenced military and political strategy throughout the region. Once Yahweh became truly portable, he observes, his worshippers gained strategic advantages that their enemies couldn't counter through conventional conquest. You can occupy territories and destroy buildings, but you can't easily eliminate ideas that live in people's minds. The Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE provided the ultimate test of this portable theology. When Titus's legions reduced Jerusalem to rubble and scattered the Jewish population across the empire, traditional religion should have died with the priesthood and sacrificial system. Instead, Yahweh's evolution into textual presence allowed Judaism to survive and even flourish in diaspora. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, according to Talmudic tradition, smuggled himself out of besieged Jerusalem in a coffin and established a new center of learning at Yavne. This wasn't just educational continuity, it was strategic preservation of an entire civilization through intellectual infrastructure. The God who had once dwelt in the temple's Holy of Holies now lived wherever scholars gathered to interpret his words. Dr. Thorne's team has collaborated with historians at the Smithsonian to analyze how this transformation influenced the development of Western civilization itself. The implications extend far beyond Jewish history, he notes, while reviewing archaeological evidence from early synagogue sites across the Roman Empire. The idea that divine truth could be accessed through individual study rather than priestly mediation would eventually reshape Christianity, Islam, and secular education systems throughout the world. The connection to contemporary American spiritual searching becomes particularly relevant here. In a culture where traditional religious authority is increasingly questioned, where institutional trust has declined across multiple generations, Yahweh's evolution from temple-based to text-based worship offers a historical precedent for finding meaning outside established hierarchies. The same portability that allowed Jewish communities to survive Roman persecution now enables individuals to maintain spiritual connection independent of geographical or institutional constraints. Dr. Sephardi has spent considerable time analyzing how this ancient transformation parallels current trends in religious practice. "We're seeing similar patterns today," he observes, while reviewing survey data from the Pew Research Center. Americans increasingly describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, seeking direct personal experience rather than mediated institutional contact with the divine. This isn't a modern innovation. It's actually a return to the kind of individual textual engagement that emerged from the Babylonian exile. The neurological implications of this shift continue to fascinate researchers. When ancient peoples transitioned from image-based to text-based religious practice, they weren't just changing theological systems, they were rewiring fundamental cognitive processes. Modern brain imaging reveals that reading sacred text activates the same neural networks involved in abstract reasoning, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. This has profound implications for understanding human potential. Dr. Mizrahi's research suggests that the development of intensive textual study traditions may have accelerated certain types of intellectual development within populations that embraced these practices. Jewish communities that maintained high levels of literacy and encouraged analytical thinking about sacred texts consistently produced disproportionate numbers of scholars, scientists, and innovative thinkers, she notes. This wasn't genetic. It was cultural training that enhanced cognitive capacity across generations. The investigation returns to geographical analysis as Dr. Benaya displays satellite imagery showing the current archaeological landscape across the ancient Near East. You can trace Yahweh's evolution by mapping the distribution of inscriptions mentioning his name, he explains, highlighting sites across modern Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Early references cluster around desert regions and trade routes. Later inscriptions appear in urban centers throughout the Persian and Hellenistic empires. This geographical spread tells a story of successful adaptation to changing circumstances. Unlike gods tied to specific temples or territories, Yahweh's mobility allowed him to establish presence wherever his worshippers traveled. Jewish merchants carried his name to Alexandria, Rome, and eventually Spain. Jewish scholars brought his texts to Babylon, Persia, and the emerging Islamic world. Each new environment forced fresh interpretation of ancient traditions. The process wasn't always smooth. Dr. Ashkenazi has documented numerous instances where local Jewish communities adapted their practices to fit new cultural contexts, sometimes in ways that would have been unrecognizable to their ancestors. Religious evolution requires constant negotiation between preservation and adaptation, she observes. Communities that remained too rigid failed to survive. Those that changed too quickly lost their distinctive identity. Success required finding the balance between continuity and innovation. This balance remains crucial for understanding contemporary spiritual searching. In an era when traditional religious frameworks often seem inadequate to address modern challenges, Yahweh's evolution offers insights into how ancient wisdom can remain relevant across radically different cultural contexts. The God who began as a desert storm deity and evolved into a universal ethical principle demonstrates the human capacity to discover transcendent meaning within changing circumstances. The archaeological record provides one final crucial insight. Sites associated with Yahweh worship consistently show evidence of literary activity. Scribal schools, libraries, copying centers. This wasn't coincidental. A God who lived in words required communities capable of preserving, interpreting, and transmitting those words across generations. The investment in education and intellectual infrastructure became a form of religious practice with practical benefits that extended far beyond purely spiritual concerns. Modern intelligence analysis reveals patterns that ancient peoples could never have recognized. Dr. Kaplan has applied network analysis techniques, originally developed for tracking terrorist organizations, to map the spread of monotheistic ideas across the ancient world. What we're seeing is a classic example of viral information transmission, he explains, while displaying a computer model that traces conceptual connections across centuries of cultural contact. The data shows how Yahweh's theological innovations spread through three distinct vectors: commercial networks, intellectual exchanges, and forced population movements. Jewish merchants carried monotheistic concepts along trade routes that connected India to Spain. Jewish scholars engaged in philosophical discussions that influenced Greek, Persian, and eventually Islamic thought. Jewish exiles, scattered by successive conquests, established communities that preserved and adapted their traditions within foreign cultural frameworks. Each transmission event involved what information theorists call adaptive mutation, small changes that made the core message more compatible with new environments while preserving essential characteristics. The storm god imagery that resonated with desert nomads was supplemented by royal metaphors that appealed to urban populations. The covenant relationship that made sense to tribal societies was expanded to include universal ethical principles that could guide complex civilizations. You begin to see the deeper pattern emerging. Yahweh's evolution wasn't random drift, but systematic optimization for survival across diverse circumstances. Every major crisis forced theological innovation that enhanced rather than diminished the core concept. Defeat in war became divine discipline. Exile became spiritual purification. Temple destruction became liberation from geographical constraints. Each apparent disaster strengthened rather than weakened the underlying belief system. Dr. Thorne has spent considerable time analyzing what he calls theological resilience factors, characteristics that allowed certain religious concepts to survive catastrophic disruption while others disappeared entirely. Yahweh developed multiple redundancy systems, he notes, while reviewing comparative data from dozens of ancient religious traditions. Physical destruction couldn't eliminate him because he wasn't primarily physical. Political conquest couldn't defeat him because he transcended political boundaries. Cultural assimilation couldn't absorb him because his identity was too clearly defined to be diluted beyond recognition. This resilience becomes particularly relevant when examining contemporary challenges to traditional religious authority. In an era when institutional trust has declined precipitously, when traditional community structures have weakened, when geographical mobility has separated individuals from ancestral support systems, Yahweh's evolution offers a template for maintaining meaningful spiritual connection despite social fragmentation. Professor Kohenet has documented how early Jewish communities developed what modern sociologists would recognize as distributed leadership models. Instead of depending on centralized priestly hierarchies, post-exilic Judaism created systems where any sufficiently educated individual could serve essential religious functions. Rabbinical authority was based on learning rather than hereditary status. Community leadership was shared among multiple individuals with different areas of expertise. This democratization of religious authority required unprecedented investment in education. Jewish communities consistently allocated disproportionate resources to ensuring literacy and analytical thinking skills across their populations. The results were measurable. Jewish communities throughout the ancient and medieval worlds produced scholars, scientists, philosophers, and innovative thinkers at rates that far exceeded their numerical representation in the broader population. The correlation isn't coincidental, Dr. Sephardi observes, while reviewing educational data spanning 2 millennia. When your religious practice requires individual engagement with complex texts, when your community survival depends on intellectual adaptability, you develop cognitive skills that transfer to every other area of human endeavor. These insights carry immediate relevance for understanding contemporary American spiritual searching. The generation currently reaching retirement age, men who lived through Vietnam, Watergate, and multiple economic disruptions, often express skepticism about institutional authority while maintaining deep spiritual curiosity. They seek meaning and transcendence, but resist submission to hierarchical control. Yahweh's evolution provides a historical model for exactly this combination of spiritual engagement and intellectual independence. Dr. Benaya's field experience has taught him to recognize patterns that extend beyond purely academic analysis. Military veterans often understand intuitively what took scholars decades to document, he notes. When your survival depends on adapting to constantly changing conditions, you develop appreciation for systems that emphasize resilience over rigidity. Yahweh's theological evolution demonstrates strategic thinking that any experienced commander would recognize. The investigation reveals one more crucial factor in Yahweh's successful transformation. Unlike religious systems that required specific cultural contexts to function effectively, monotheistic practice proved remarkably portable across linguistic, ethnic, and geographical boundaries. Jewish communities maintained distinct identity while adapting to Persian, Greek, Roman, Islamic, and Christian civilizations. The core theological principles remained intact, while surface practices evolved to fit new circumstances. This adaptability resulted from the text-based nature of post-exilic Judaism. Written traditions could be translated, interpreted, and applied to novel situations without losing essential meaning. Oral traditions, by contrast, were vulnerable to gradual distortion across generations and cultural transitions. The decision to encode Yahweh's essence in written form, rather than relying on temple rituals or hereditary priesthood, proved to be the key innovation that ensured long-term survival. The implications extend far beyond religious history into questions that concern anyone wrestling with how to maintain authentic values while adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. The question becomes particularly urgent in contemporary America, where rapid technological change, economic uncertainty, and social fragmentation challenge traditional sources of meaning and stability. How do you maintain authentic identity while adapting to circumstances that your ancestors never could have imagined? Yahweh's evolution offers practical insights that extend far beyond purely religious concerns. Dr. Ashkenazi has collaborated with sociologists at Harvard to study how communities successfully navigate cultural transitions while preserving core values. The pattern appears consistently across successful adaptation stories, she notes, while reviewing case studies from multiple historical periods. Groups that survive and thrive through major disruption share certain characteristics. They distinguish clearly between essential principles and contingent practices. They invest heavily in education and analytical thinking, and they maintain strong internal communication networks. These factors explain why Jewish communities not only survived, but often flourished despite centuries of persecution, displacement, and cultural pressure. They also suggest strategies that contemporary individuals might employ when wrestling with questions of meaning and purpose in an era of constant change. The archaeological investigation has revealed something else. Evidence that Yahweh's transformation influenced the development of philosophical thinking throughout the ancient world. Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who lived in cities with significant Jewish populations, developed concepts of monotheistic divinity that closely paralleled Hebrew theological innovations. Islamic scholars in medieval Spain, working alongside Jewish colleagues, produced synthetic philosophical systems that combined monotheistic principles with Aristotelian logic. Ideas cross cultural boundaries more easily than people often realize, Dr. Sephardi observes, while reviewing manuscripts from medieval libraries in Cordoba and Baghdad. Yahweh's theological evolution contributed to the development of philosophical monotheism throughout the Mediterranean world. By the time Christianity and Islam emerged, the conceptual groundwork had already been established. This cross-cultural influence helps explain why monotheistic principles appear in secular contexts throughout Western civilization. The idea that existence has underlying unity, that moral principles transcend cultural boundaries, that individual consciousness can access universal truths. These concepts trace directly to theological innovations that began with Yahweh's transformation from storm god to cosmic sovereign. The implications for contemporary spiritual searching become clear when you examine how these ancient insights address modern concerns. In an era when traditional community structures have weakened, when geographical mobility separates individuals from ancestral support systems, when institutional authority faces widespread skepticism, the model of portable, text-based spiritual practice offers practical alternatives to both rigid fundamentalism and relativistic drift. Dr. Mizrahi has spent considerable time analyzing what she calls post-institutional spirituality, the growing tendency among educated Americans to seek transcendent meaning outside traditional religious frameworks. We're seeing patterns that closely parallel the post-exilic period in Jewish history, she notes, while reviewing survey data from religious polling organizations. People want authentic spiritual experience, but they're unwilling to surrender intellectual autonomy to institutional authority. This creates both opportunities and challenges. The same technological systems that enable global communication and access to unprecedented amounts of information also produce fragmentation, isolation, and information overload. The democratization of knowledge that allows individuals to study ancient wisdom traditions directly also eliminates traditional filtering mechanisms that helped distinguish reliable guidance from mere opinion. Yahweh's evolution suggests one possible solution: the development of interpretive communities that combine intellectual rigor with shared commitment to transcendent values. Early Jewish communities succeeded by creating educational systems that encouraged analytical thinking while maintaining connection to ancient wisdom. They preserved textual traditions while adapting interpretive methods to address new circumstances. The contemporary application involves creating similar communities around shared intellectual and spiritual interests rather than geographical proximity or inherited religious identity. Online platforms, educational institutions, reading groups, and professional associations can serve functions that traditional religious communities once provided, offering opportunities for serious engagement with fundamental questions while maintaining respect for individual autonomy and intellectual integrity. Dr. Thorne has observed this pattern developing spontaneously in various contexts. Military veterans often form informal study groups focused on philosophical and spiritual questions, he notes. Professional associations sometimes evolve into communities that address existential concerns alongside career development. Book clubs and educational programs can become vehicles for serious engagement with transcendent meaning. The key insight from Yahweh's evolution is that spiritual authenticity doesn't require abandoning intellectual sophistication. The same God who began as a desert storm deity eventually became sophisticated enough to inspire philosophical systems that influenced Greek, Islamic, and Christian thought. The transformation didn't eliminate mystery or transcendence. It deepened both by providing conceptual frameworks capable of addressing complex questions without reducing them to simplistic answers. This balance between intellectual engagement and spiritual openness appears particularly relevant for men who have reached middle age with significant professional and life experience. The same analytical skills that proved valuable in military service, business leadership, or technical careers can become tools for engaging ancient wisdom traditions that offer perspectives on meaning, purpose, and mortality that secular frameworks often fail to address adequately. The investigation returns to its archaeological foundations as Dr. Thorne's team prepares to synthesize their findings. In the laboratory's controlled environment, surrounded by artifacts spanning 3 millennia, the full scope of Yahweh's transformation becomes visible. Clay tablets record his earliest appearances among desert nomads. Stone inscriptions document his evolution through various cultural contacts. Manuscript fragments preserve the theological innovations that emerged from exile and return. What we're witnessing, Dr. Thorne reflects, while examining a Dead Sea Scroll fragment containing portions of Isaiah, is the most successful example of adaptive evolution in the history of human consciousness. A regional deity became a universal principle without losing his essential character. That's unprecedented in religious history. The evidence suggests that Yahweh's transformation succeeded because it addressed fundamental human needs that transcend specific cultural contexts. The desire for meaning in the face of suffering, the search for moral guidance in complex situations, the hunger for connection with something larger than individual existence. These needs appear consistently across cultures and historical periods. Yahweh's evolution provided a framework for addressing these concerns that proved remarkably durable across changing circumstances. Dr. Kadish has spent considerable time analyzing what she calls transformation triggers, specific historical moments when theological innovation accelerated. Crisis consistently produced breakthrough rather than breakdown, she observes, while reviewing chronological data. Each major disruption, Assyrian conquest, Babylonian exile, Roman destruction of the temple, resulted in theological developments that enhanced rather than diminished the core concept. This pattern offers insights that extend beyond religious history into questions of personal resilience and adaptation. The same principles that allowed ancient communities to maintain identity and purpose through catastrophic change might guide contemporary individuals navigating their own transitions and challenges. The key insight involves distinguishing between essential identity and contingent circumstances. Yahweh's worshippers learned to separate core principles from specific practices, fundamental beliefs from particular cultural expressions. This flexibility allowed them to adapt to new environments without losing authentic connection to their spiritual heritage. For men in their 40s and 50s who have experienced significant life changes, career transitions, family disruptions, health challenges, or simply the recognition that many assumptions from earlier decades no longer apply, This ancient wisdom offers practical guidance. The question isn't whether change will occur, but how to navigate change while preserving what matters most. Dr. Benaya has observed this pattern repeatedly in his military experience. Successful adaptation requires clear understanding of mission-critical objectives, he notes. You can modify tactics, change equipment, adjust to new terrain, but you have to maintain focus on essential goals. Ancient Jewish communities understood this intuitively. They preserved what was crucial and adapted everything else. The archaeological record reveals one more crucial factor: the importance of intergenerational wisdom transmission. Yahweh's successful evolution wasn't accomplished by single individuals or even single generations. It required sustained effort across centuries, with each generation building on previous innovations while addressing new challenges. This has profound implications for contemporary spiritual searching. The tendency to seek purely individual solutions to existential questions, while understandable given the weakening of traditional community structures, often results in spiritual isolation and conceptual drift. Yahweh's evolution demonstrates the value of engaging with traditions that have been tested across multiple generations and diverse circumstances. The engagement doesn't require uncritical acceptance. Early Jewish scholars developed sophisticated interpretive methods that allowed them to extract relevant guidance from ancient texts while adapting applications to contemporary circumstances. They combined respect for traditional wisdom with intellectual rigor in ways that enhanced both spiritual authenticity and practical effectiveness. Professor Ashkenazi has documented how this approach influenced the development of analytical thinking throughout Western civilization. The rabbinical method of textual interpretation, examining multiple perspectives, identifying underlying principles, applying ancient insights to novel situations, became a template for scholarly inquiry that extends far beyond religious contexts, she notes. These intellectual tools remain valuable for anyone wrestling with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and identity. The same analytical approach that allowed ancient scholars to extract timeless principles from time-bound cultural expressions can help contemporary individuals distinguish between essential truths and contingent circumstances in their own experience. The investigation concludes with recognition that Yahweh's transformation continues in the present moment. Every individual who encounters this ancient tradition must decide how to understand and apply its insights within contemporary circumstances. The process of interpretation and application that began with desert nomads continues with anyone who seriously engages these questions. Dr. Sephardi returns to the linguistic evidence that began their investigation. The name Yahweh derives from the Hebrew root meaning to be or to become, he explains while displaying the ancient tetragrammaton on the laboratory screen. It's not a static identification, but a dynamic description. This God's essence involves ongoing becoming rather than fixed being. This insight may explain why Yahweh's worship proved so adaptable across changing circumstances. Instead of defending a particular cultural form, his followers were engaging with a principle of transformation itself. The God of becoming could evolve because evolution was built into his essential nature from the beginning. The laboratory grows quiet as the investigation draws to its conclusion. Dr. Thorne and his team have traced a journey spanning over 3 millennia, from the earliest Sumerian records of divine councils to the contemporary quest for authentic spiritual meaning. The artifacts surrounding them, clay tablets, stone inscriptions, manuscript fragments, bear witness to one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. When we began this investigation, Dr. Thorne reflects, we were tracking the evolution of a divine name. What we discovered was something far more significant: the development of human consciousness itself. Yahweh's transformation from storm god to universal principle mirrors humanity's own journey from tribal survival to global awareness. The implications ripple outward from ancient history into contemporary life. In an era when traditional sources of meaning face unprecedented challenges, when technological change outpaces cultural adaptation, when individual mobility often means separation from ancestral wisdom, Yahweh's evolution offers both comfort and guidance. The comfort lies in recognition that profound transformation doesn't require abandonment of authentic identity. The God who began among desert nomads and evolved through royal courts, prophetic visions, and exilic reflection remained fundamentally consistent even while adapting to radically different circumstances. Essential character can survive, even be strengthened by dramatic external change. The guidance emerges from understanding how this transformation occurred. It wasn't accidental drift, but purposeful adaptation guided by clear principles. The distinction between core values and contingent practices allowed flexibility without compromising integrity. Investment in education and analytical thinking provided tools for navigating complex challenges. Commitment to transcendent purpose offered motivation for persevering through difficulty. Dr. Kadish returns to the linguistic analysis that has threaded through their investigation. The Tetragrammaton, those 4 Hebrew letters that spell Yahweh's name, represents something unique in ancient religion, she notes. It's not a description of what God does or where he lives or how he appears. It's a statement about the nature of existence itself. I am that I am, or I will be who I will be. It's the principle of being, of becoming, of conscious existence engaging with itself. This philosophical sophistication helps explain why Yahweh's worship influenced the development of Western thought far beyond purely religious contexts. The idea that existence has underlying unity, that consciousness can apprehend universal principles, that individual experience connects to transcendent reality. These concepts shaped philosophy, science, and ethics throughout Mediterranean civilization. They continue to shape contemporary spiritual searching. The growing number of Americans who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious are often seeking exactly what Yahweh's evolution demonstrates: connection to transcendent meaning without submission to institutional control, engagement with ancient wisdom without abandonment of intellectual integrity, authentic spiritual experience within contemporary circumstances. Dr. Benaya has observed this pattern among military veterans who return from deployment with profound questions about meaning and purpose. Combat experience often strips away superficial certainties, he notes. Men who have faced mortality directly, who have seen how quickly circumstances can change, often develop hunger for spiritual understanding that goes beyond conventional religious answers. They need frameworks that can handle complexity without reducing it to platitudes. Yahweh's evolution provides exactly such a framework. The God who began in crisis and deepened through catastrophe offers companionship for anyone wrestling with fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and identity. His transformation from one voice among many to the sole source of cosmic meaning demonstrates that authentic spiritual development often requires exactly the kind of careful thinking and intellectual courage that characterizes successful leadership in other areas of life. The investigation concludes not with final answers, but with renewed appreciation for the questions themselves. Every generation must rediscover these issues for itself, trace these patterns through its own experience, encounter these ancient echoes within contemporary circumstances. The cuneiform tablets lie silent in museum cases now, their urgent messages translated into academic footnotes. But the questions they raised about power, purpose, and presence echo still. Dr. Thorne's voice carries the weight of decades spent in direct contact with humanity's earliest attempts to name the divine. "What we've traced tonight is more than religious history," he says, while the laboratory's lights dim toward evening. "It's the story of how human consciousness evolved to recognize unity within diversity, meaning within apparent chaos, purpose within the seeming randomness of existence. Somewhere between the crowded heavens of ancient Mesopotamia and the singular sky of monotheism, humanity discovered that the most important divine attribute isn't omnipotence, it's the willingness to be found by those who seek. That discovery remains active, waiting in the space between certainty and mystery, where all the most important conversations begin. As you contemplate these ancient echoes in the quiet of your own evening, remember that every whispered prayer, every silent wonder, every act of compassion continues this conversation. The Anunnaki governed through cosmic bureaucracy. Yahweh transformed governance into relationship, an eternal dialogue between finite consciousness and infinite possibility. The archaeological record closes here, but the investigation continues. The name that began under desert skies continues speaking. In conscience, in wonder, in the persistent human conviction that existence means more than it appears to mean.